wasn't for an eclipse, Christopher Columbus and his men would have starved to death. Back in the day, the Spanish were about three things. That was chiseled jawlines, if you know, you know, exploration, and subjugation. Because of exploration, the Spanish had a very thorough knowledge of the stars and how to get from point A to point B using them. On his last voyage, he goes back to Jamaica and he's like, we don't have any food. Where's all of our food? And the natives are like, we are setting boundaries. We don't like the way you and your men are treating us, so we're not feeding you anymore, and maybe you'll just leave. Columbus starts freaking out. He doesn't want to die in Jamaica from starvation, but he remembers he knows someone. And that someone was Abraham Sakuda. He was a rabbi, a scientist, a mathematician, a doctor, all of the above. But most importantly, he was an astronomer and an astrologist. And he wrote an almanac about the moon and its position and how it would look in the sky. So Columbus comes up with this plan, and he tells the natives, you don't want to piss God off, okay? You need to hand over the food. What are you even talking about? God loves me, and he doesn't want me and my men to starve to death. Okay, prove it. That moon over there is going to turn blood red because God is angry with how you're treating us and that you're not giving us any food. If that moon turns blood red, we will give you food. And that night, they saw the red moon eclipse, and this was what was written by Columbus's son, I believe. With great howling and lamentation, they came running from every direction to the ships, laden with provisions, praying the admiral to intercede by all means with God on their behalf, that he might not visit wrath upon them. Now, Columbus knew how long the eclipse would last, 48 minutes. The natives were begging him, essentially, to ask God to not bring wrath on them. So he took his hourglass and he started to pray. And at the end of the 48 minutes, the eclipse went away. And he told them that God had pardoned them. This man was trying to sell enslaved people and ended up becoming enslaved himself. This is Ayuba Suleiman Diallo. He was born in the 1700s in what is now called Senegal in West Africa. He came from a very prominent family. His family was highly engaged in religious affairs and politics. In 1730, he was trying to buy supplies and sell enslaved people to the Royal African Company, a British trading company, something that he had done many times before. People at the Royal African Company ended up kidnapping him and his translator and selling them into bondage. He managed to convince the captain of his royal status because he had sold enslaved people to him before. By the time the captain relayed the message to his family to pay the ransom, they were halfway across the Atlantic and it was too late. The ship ended up docking in Maryland, and he ended up being taken to Annapolis, where he was sold and made to work on a tobacco farm. But this did not go well. He was seen as unfit to work in a field. Remember, he was royalty and he wasn't used to back-breaking labor. Eventually, he did try to run away, but he was caught and he was put in jail. He was in jail. They were trying to find his rationale for running away, but they didn't understand him because he didn't speak English. Eventually, he found a lawyer, Thomas Blewett, who was able to find a Wolof translator who was able to interpret what Ayuba was saying. The lawyer asked him to write down everything he was trying to say, and he wrote it in Arabic. Now remember, his family was very prominent in Islamic religious and political circles. Now eventually the letter that he wrote reached the desk of James Oglethorpe, the owner of the Royal African Company. And for some reason, he couldn't believe that this happened. Side note, you literally trade people for a living. And he went to the University of Oxford to have it authenticated. And he ended up purchasing Ayuba's freedom for £45. That's not where the story ends. Ayuba ended up going to England and his lawyer came with him. Now at this point, Ayuba was just the property of the Royal African Company. And that's essentially where they sent him after they purchased him, to their office, like a package being sent to your job. Now Ayuba got wind that they were going to sell him again, this time to African traders. He ended up contacting his lawyer. His lawyer was like, it's okay, I got this. His lawyer took him to his home and gave him the reassurance that, hey, if I sell you, I'll tell you first. In 1734, he was able to return to Gambia. When he got there, he realized his village had been ravaged by war. His father had died and one of his wives had remarried. But because he had status in the area, he was able to continue his life and lifestyle that he had prior to being enslaved himself, including enslaving other people. In 1736, he was captured by the French for his allegiances to England, and for 2 years he asked England for help to get him out of French prison, and they turned him down every time. And eventually in 1773, he died, and his memoir can be read in French and in English. Working for this man was literally a death sentence for a lot of Americans. This is John Rockefeller, one of the richest men in America. And I'm not even kidding. A lot of people died because of him. But anytime something would go wrong and people would start to protest, he would call one man. His name was Ivy Lee. He was a publicist, also a public relations expert, and he's considered the inventor of modern-day public relations and the press release. He was so good at writing press releases that newspapers didn't catch on, and they thought that they were articles, and they would just run them right like normal articles, essentially giving free advertisement to whoever he was working for. The Rockefellers loved this man. John Rockefeller had the same relationship with the media that I have with the police. If you don't talk to them, they might leave you alone. Ivy Lee came along and was like, that's stupid. You need to talk to the media. After 2 women and 11 children died, Ivy Lee made it all go away. Americans hated the Rockefellers with a passion, and they would always have protests against them. The Rockefellers were greedy as hell. They would open mines in the most remote places and build houses there. So essentially the workforce that lived there also had to pay them rent, which they would dock from their paycheck. They would hire several groups of workers that didn't speak the same language, and they would split them up so they couldn't communicate with each other, and they couldn't communicate with union organizers either. And then they would just end people's lives. They would call in their own private military, the National Guard of whatever state they were in, to the point where a president had to get involved in calling the army because what are you even doing, and why do you have your own private army to end people's lives? This guy's job was to strictly make them look human, and he basically did. And he essentially changed how Americans saw the Rockefellers. And in 1914, the Rockefellers called in their private military to stop people from striking in Colorado, and they ended up ending the lives of a lot of people and just leaving them there, to the point where trains that were passing by saw fields full of decomposing bodies. This guy came in and was like, if you're going to do that, you're going to have to go there and listen to what they are complaining about to begin with. So he sponsored a plaque to be unveiled, and he got one of the widows of one of the men that was unalived by his private army to unveil it. He didn't say anything to the people or do anything to make their situations better. He just stayed there and listened. Outside of this man, the only thing that saved John Rockefeller from that was the fact that it was World War I. Ivy Lee knew that, and he told the Rockefellers that, hey, if you want Americans to love you, you're going to have to do your big one. So the Rockefellers all got their money together, and they ended up funding the construction of Rockefeller Center. Now, of course, this was one of their big things, and this happened about 15 years after what happened in Colorado. They set up charitable trusts and educational trusts in the meantime. And that was mostly because of this man basically telling them, like, hey, if you want to repair your image, you're going to have to give up some money. But this man's tactics are still used today. Basically, hey, if the public doesn't like something, say it in a way that will get them to fall in line and make them like it. Just like when people say TikTok is a national security risk when they don't do anything different from what other apps are already doing.